Good morning, and thank you for joining us. Today is Monday, June 29th, 2026, and we are here in the Board of County Commissioners conference room in our Administrative Services building in Larimer up in Fort Collins, and we are here to do a work session on data center regulations, and we have a bunch of staff here. I'll introduce them in a minute. I'm Larimer County Commissioner Jody Shad McNally, Chair of the Board of County Commissioners. I welcome you. I'm joined at the dais or at the conference table with Commissioner Kafalis. Commissioner Stevens is excused today. We also have our County Manager, Loren DeVolker, at the table. We have our Community Planning Infrastructure and Resources Director, Leslie Ellis. Really who will be kind of leading this discussion is our Community Development Director, Rebecca Everett. And so as we start this today, I'm just going to turn this over to her. We have a lot of staff. I'll let you introduce your staff as we go through this. And I'm looking forward to this discussion today. Thank you so much.
Yes, good morning, Commissioners. Thank you for having us today. We're here to provide an update on the effort to develop regulations related to data centers within our land use code. And I'm joined up here at the table by Scott Benton, our environmental planner, and Cassidy Fior, principal planner, who are the primary team who are working on this effort. We are also joined today by Jenny Oxmaker, our planning manager, and we have Mark Johnston and Janine Lettingham from Economic and Workforce Development, who we have been partnering with on this project as well. We're excited to share with you the results of recent outreach, engagement with boards and commissions, and the in-depth research and analysis that the team has been working on to date. This work session is really a pivotal point in the project where we are seeking your direction on how to proceed forward with the actual drafting of regulations based on the research and information that we have collected so far. So our goal for the work session today is first to summarize the outreach and analysis that has been completed so far in the project, and then to receive direction from you on next steps for code drafting, as well as additional community engagement expectations that you may have. And we will have a series of questions that Scott will be posing for your feedback. So now I will pass it over to Scott Benton, who will share the rest of the presentation, and we hope to have plenty of time for questions and discussion as well. Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning, Commissioners. So if we start with the project purpose and need, data centers are being built all across the U.S. and the world, including nearby, specifically across the state line in Cheyenne and Wyoming, and then one as near as just outside of Windsor in Weld County. So they're becoming more and more common, and Larimer County can expect to receive proposals at some point. Because of the scale of data centers, the scale of these new data centers, they can have significant impacts on infrastructure and resources. And we currently, the land use code does not have any language around data centers, no definitions or review standards or anything like that. So if an application were to be submitted, staff do not have a way to evaluate that request appropriately or at all. So that's the intention of this project, is to update the land use code to provide the tools in order to be able to review a data center. Things like definition, thresholds, standards, and review criteria. If we touch on the next steps that will be coming real briefly, the current moratorium as it stands ends on August 25th, so staff feels like we need some more time in order to receive more input and also to develop the regulations. So we will be requesting a 6-month extension on July 13th at that land use hearing, and that could take it to February 2027. Whether we need that whole time or not sure, but that would allow an additional 6 months of time. Our colleagues in the Economic and Workforce Development that are here now, they'll be issuing a business focus survey very shortly, I would imagine. And after that, that will be open. Staff will start drafting language and review criteria. And then once it's ready, staff would open that to public comment. So one reason, so there's enough time for people to think about it and form an opinion but also so that the first time the public sees this new language wouldn't be at a hearing. We also want to do another round of input from advisory boards, and eventually we'll go to a hearing with Planning Commission and with yourselves at a land use hearing for a final decision. So if we keep some key questions in mind as we go through the presentation, the first has a few questions, right? But essentially, it's what guidance does the county commissioners have for developing land use code requirements? More specifically, what level of regulation and or limitations do the commissioners support? Do the proposed data center definition and thresholds align with commissioner and community expectations? And are there any locations or zone districts in the county that may be appropriate for data centers, of course being subject to development standards and review processes? And then secondly, what expectations do the commissioners have for further public outreach? We've done quite a bit of work on this so far, so if I try to summarize this fairly quickly, we've done a lot of interviews with various organizations, individuals, municipalities, counties, and state representatives across the U.S. The intention of this was to hear the lessons learned from people who have adopted regulations already, who already have data centers. What did they like, what they did, what they did not like, what would they do differently, unintended consequences, that sort of thing. We also have a graduate student. His name is Clay Vitek. Hopefully he's listening in. He did some really good research for us, very thorough research. He's a graduate student in the Master of Urban and Regional Planning program in Denver. We've conducted outreach with other county departments, IT, the assessor's office, who would determine how data centers are taxed, and the Economic and Workforce Development Group. We have had a public survey that was open for quite a while, and we'll talk about that more in some future slides. And so far, we've conducted visits and outreach to various boards and commissions with the Environmental Science Advisory Board, the Agricultural Advisory Board, and the Planning Commission. And we hope to visit the Natural Resources Advisory Board and the Economic Workforce Development Board as well. And just so that we're all on the same page as we talk about all of these things, there's some key terms and considerations. So data centers are structures that house IT equipment, things like servers, networking equipment, and storage, and it's commonly referred to as digital infrastructure. They have existed in some form for many years, and the common types that you can see are edge and enterprise. These two are smaller and have been around for longer. Edge facilities are things like telecommunications facilities and can be quite small. Enterprise are things that are, for example, we have rows of servers in the basement of this building that service the county. That is an example of an enterprise data center. Co-located are managed by an entity, and then various companies rent out services from that data center. As far as scale goes, they're kind of mid-scale. Hyperscale and AI factories are the new ones that you hear most about in the news. These are the ones that can be very large and usually have one customer, think Amazon Web Services or Meta, the large technical company or technology companies. And they are the ones that are very large and also very new. A data center facility can include all the other ancillary structures that are required in order for a data center to exist. So power infrastructure, these could be things like substations, transmission lines. It could be power generation on site. There can be backup power systems, think diesel generators, and there can be other kinds too. Cooling equipment and structures, stormwater facilities, offices, and security buildings. And one thing to consider that is important is that the technology around data centers is evolving very rapidly. It's all changing very fast. So from the chips and the equipment that does the data processing to the cooling technology and all the above, there's a lot of change happening very fast. Another thing to make sure we're all on the same page, there's a lot of potential impacts from data centers. the county has direct jurisdiction over some, but not all. So a good example is ratepayer protections. The county is not a power provider, and we don't determine power rates. That's not something that is under our purview. Other things are, like setbacks or noise. That is something we have direct influence over. And it's not that for things like water usage and power usage, there are some things that we can do, like impact studies, but we're not the end-all, be-all authority on those things. If we touch on some of the key findings from the research and policy analysis that has happened, Clay, our graduate student, and I suppose I wanted to mention we've had the graduate student who's been doing research, staff that's been doing research, and input from all the boards. There are some recurring themes in all of those, which is encouraging that we're finding some similar results, information, and recommendations. So,
And I hope you hear some of the feedback from the commissioners too, because I know we've sent some things as well. Just wanted the public to know that we've been sending things in as we learn, because I'm working nationally on that for over a year and a half. So I've been trying to send you some things. So I hope those were somehow incorporated. So hope my voice has a little bit of pull in some of that. So yeah.
yes, of course. And there was one in particular that was some lessons learned from a Virginia delegate that was particularly useful. So Clay, our graduate student, his research project was very thorough, as I said, and it did a really good job of addressing the history of data centers, kinds of data centers, common elements of data centers, and scale. He provided some recommendations as well, and some of his findings to note were that there are some things that can be addressed that can touch on many impacts at once. So a good example was the noise. Data centers can produce a lot of noise, and by addressing those impacts, you touch on a lot of different things like setbacks or the cooling technologies, or potentially where you can meet those setbacks in terms of zone districts and space. So by addressing one thing, you can address many others at once. I found it very important to require reporting, usage reporting specifically for water and power, and also impact studies. And he thought that efficiency metrics were promising tools. These are things like water use efficiency, WE, power use efficiency, PUE, and renewable energy factors. By addressing those, you touch on a lot of different impact mitigation as well. During staff's research, we found important to note that there are newer and there are older data centers. So when the technology is evolving so quickly, many of the articles that you hear about, a data center that's very large in Virginia, right? It's designed differently, it cools differently, the chips are different, versus some of the newer data centers that are being built elsewhere. So in water-stressed areas, for example, closed-loop systems are becoming more common. And that can raise questions as well, but it's just to note that not all data centers are the same. There's a lot of legislation being proposed across the U.S. There were 2 bills that were proposed in Colorado. Neither one passed in the most recent legislative session. One was more industry-backed and one was more environmental group-backed, but neither one passed. We would expect to see some future legislation proposed as well. Staff also find it very important to focus on transparency and monitoring. Transparency both in the review process, all the information that's provided to staff, as well as operation and any other consideration to understand how much power was expected to be used versus how much is actually used, same with water or any other metric.
Can I pause you there? Fortunately and unfortunately, there have been a lot of conversations over the last 6 weeks, including over the weekend, on data centers and how rapidly it's changing. And I know of some of the projects happening on the Wyoming border and kind of going around Colorado. But the discussion, when you brought up transparency, a lot of these data centers who might be bringing, wherever they're at, bringing applications, they might be cautious about what kind of technology or details they bring because it's such a competitive, fast-evolving market, and they may not want other even countries or groups to be able to see where they're at. So how how will we address that, especially in the ever-changing technology, which has changed since February, when I've been really deep in, I mean, it's amazing how since February, things have massively changed. And I'm wondering, when you talk about transparency, we need to honor that they have, proprietary things they don't want out in the public, but also we need to understand how they're being operated. So do you think there's a balance there from what you've seen so far? And when you talk about transparency, how do we balance that? Because I understand we need to honor and think about their proprietary things they need to keep top secret, but also might apply to how they operate. So I'm wondering about that. I've been talking about that recently with some other commissioners, and I'm wondering what you guys think about that so far as we're going forward. And I hate to pause you, but when you talk about transparent, that's the first thing that popped in my mind.
No, thank you. It's a good question, and if anybody wants to chime in, feel free to. I don't have a solid answer. I know in Lynn County, Iowa, in their code, it's written in code, everything is assumed to be open to the public unless specifically said so, and that's an approach. There could be some restrictions on staff signing non-disclosure agreements. I'm not sure exactly how you go about it, but there could be some options. That's one thing that we would need to figure out.
If I could chime in on there too, I think when we talk about transparency for the public, I think it's most important that we're transparent with impacts and really clear on what the kind of cause and effect is, so that for you all as decision makers and for the community, they can understand what to expect if there was an application for a data center. Some of the technology behind what might be driving those impacts or what's happening internal to the building, it may be appropriate for some amount of privacy, for security or proprietary information type reasons. But to the extent that there is an impact to water, power, noise, heat, air quality, impacts that extend beyond the boundaries of that building, that's where I think it's very important that we prioritize transparency.
I appreciate that, and that's kind of where I'm at as well, but I also know, it's so changing so fast. Some of these new technologies have maybe impacts we don't even know what questions to ask, and so that's why I'm wondering about that. One thing maybe you can put in the parking lot as we go forward, when we go back on page 4, when you talk about impacts, what we have over, this is some, I want to talk about vibrations. I don't see that on the list. It's a noise thing, but also I think it's a different category, and I think vibrations and that, I think that impacts wildlife as well as humans and plants, and I just wondered if that's something we had looked at and talked about that as, because I know there's a noise category, but I think it has to be a whole separate thing to look at, so I'm just curious about that. But you don't have to answer it now. I want to go ahead and let you proceed, but can you put that in the parking lot in case I forget to ask?
Yeah, that one's actually a little easier to address because we do have some specific recommendations around that. We just haven't got to the slide
Okay,
yet.
I'm
Yeah.
jumping way ahead. As you can tell, I've been waiting to talk about this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One thing that we've noticed is that there are several locations that have initially offered incentives to bring data centers to them and are now clawing those incentives back. So that seemed pretty significant to us. And another thing that we found important was to consider the whole life cycle of facility. And this could be taken in a few ways. One is the operation. So if in water-stressed areas there are more closed-loop cooling systems, they use far less water, which is great. However, that water also has several additives to it, and it picks up heavy metals from being in those pipes. So that water has to be changed out. So on one hand, you gain a great efficiency in terms of the quantity of water, but then on the other hand, you also have a lot of discharge water that has to be dealt with in some way. So there are trade-offs there, so trying to adequately consider those considerations over time as it operates is important. Similarly with the actual servers and the IT equipment, that can change over time. in good ways. If they can operate at higher temperatures and they require less cooling, that's wonderful. But then you have to dispose of all of the old server equipment. And then another way to consider it is at the very end of the facility. Nobody has a glass ball, so we don't know what's going to happen in 20, 25 years. So if data centers are so different from how they are now or how they're being built, what do you then do with that facility, with a very large structure, with all that equipment, and also things like power purchase agreements? If infrastructure was built out in order to provide that power and there's a certain amount of payment that goes into that contract, then what happens in those situations as well? To summarize some of the feedback that we've received from Environmental Science and Agricultural Advisory Board and the Planning Commission, one mention was to tie impact evaluation to size thresholds so that not all data centers are being treated the same way. So an enterprise facility, for example, is not being treated the same as a hyperscale facility. Two very different things. Focus should be placed on avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating impacts, and we should also address cumulative impacts, which I'll admit is a very tricky business. It does not mean that we should not do it. The suggestion was that we do address it, but it's tricky. Commissioner, here's one on noise. The noise ordinance should be updated and to measure noise in different ranges, dBA as well as dBc, and that's to address some of the vibration, some of that lower scale noise. There's also a change in the ordinance that was suggested of how you, it's line versus point sources. It affects your calculations, your models. If you consider a single point source of noise versus a long linear of noise, and data centers can be very long, so that changes your modeling. And also the point at which that noise is measured, whether you do it closer to the source or further to something like a resonance. Another concern that was brought up was the proximity of industrial light zones to residential areas. Most of those concerns came from Environmental Science Advisory Board that I just went over. For the Ag Advisory Board, a large concern was the potential conversion of ag land, especially irrigated ag land, for the purpose of data centers, as well as ag water rights, so by and dry, essentially.
And I know that's happening in Utah and in Iowa, so I know it's a valid concern, and it's actually happening at a pretty increased scale right now. It's kind of alarming to see what's been happening, so I think that's, I don't know what we have learned from that, but it seems like that is happening at a pretty fast scale, so.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
There were suggestions to focus on performance standards versus trying to, it'd be hard to write code that addresses every new technological advancement, right? So we should focus on performance standards. If incentives are offered, they should be transparent and carefully reviewed, and there should be a clear line drawn in between the incentive that's offered and the benefit that's received for county residents. There were suggestions to, if groundwater is used, to explore potential groundwater impacts, and also some positive things like waste heat recovery, which is a potential benefit. There was one mention from the Planning Commission work session. I wrote it as some interest in receiving benefit of data centers, not just secondhand negative effects. And to provide some context, if the data centers are being built all around us, and Larimer County residents are experiencing some of the consequences of that in terms of air quality or power demand, then we could have a data center ourselves and see some of the benefit from taxes and not just the impacts. Switching gears a little bit to talk about the results of the public survey or public input in general. So we've had a dedicated public input webpage where comments could be provided, and a public input webpage, so a county webpage and a public input webpage. And we've also had a survey through the public input website, and we had a total of 7,047 respondents, which was excellent response. Just over 6,300 of those responses were county residents, We did have respondents from 19 countries and many, many states. We did look at the results of the survey from just county residents versus total respondents, and there was very minimal difference in the results. And then this slide discusses some the key findings of that for what impacts are most concerning. The easy way to say that is they were all concerning to varying degrees, some as high as almost 96% and some as high as about 52%. For the benefits, the response was kind of the opposite. There wasn't much interest in potential benefits. And 94% of respondents did not support a data center in Larimer County. And then if we switch gears again and start talking about possible updates. So if all that was background information and then we start to discuss what possible land use code updates could be, I wanted to start with this review continuum where on one end you have the least restrictive set of regulations and on the other end you have the most restrictive set of regulations. Option 1 on this slide would be the least restrictive and essentially saying Larimer County is open for business. On option 3, on the opposite end of that continuum would be data centers are not permitted in Larimer County. In the middle could be something like option 2, where data centers could be in Larimer County, but you have to meet all of the review criteria in order to be here. And quite possibly those review criteria could be tied to those power thresholds to make sure we don't over-regulate or under-regulate. And again, from here on out, these are examples for discussion purpose. They are not, it's not saying this is what is going to be or what it has to be. This is just for conversation at this point and examples. Here's what a definition could read as. I'm not going to read it verbatim, but our intention was to provide a definition that addressed what a data center is, the functions that it performs, whether it is built in all in one go or across phases, and for the different purposes of a data center, like also including cryptocurrency mining. There are some potential thresholds in there as well. We have done some research on thresholds to try to understand what are existing large loads serviced in Larimer County. They tend to be less than 25 megawatts, or I have yet to find one that is over 25 megawatts. So that's the reason why we set that that middle threshold there, 5 to 25. Again, it's a recommendation, not final. There are some large load tariff policies proposed that utilize a higher threshold. So it depends. And not all of those are passed either. There's one in front of FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, right now. That could be 45 megawatts, but it's not voted on yet, so that's not final. It's really just to provide some useful categories of how to evaluate data centers. Another possible update deals with the uses and zones and process. So again, for the uses, I'm not going to read it verbatim, but the intention is to provide a principal use and all the accessory uses that could go along with the data center facility. Example of allowable zone districts could be heavy industrial only or heavy and light industrial. You know, those are two options. There could be others too. In terms of processes, special review is a logical contender for a data center because it's designed for something that you don't see every day, like a data center. It is also one of the more stringent review processes that the county has. You could also have more than one process included on the same project. So 1041 is a consideration if they have new power generation or new transmission lines, potentially new water lines that meet a certain threshold, then that could trigger the need for a 1041 as well as a special review. For this slide here, it's touching on some of those impacts that the county has more direct purview over and some of the review criteria and the mechanisms that we can use to address those. So we can update various sections of the land use code. We can Commissioner Shattuck McNally for noise. There's the noise ordinance right there. That would be something that would be updated to address more things. There's also some legal mechanisms like development agreements, community benefit agreements, findings and resolutions with conditions. These are other mechanisms and tools that we can use to apply what we want to a data center application. And then I have some recommendations that staff has. I can do as you wish if we want to talk about these recommendations now. If you want to ask any more questions now, I could go straight to recommendations, or if you want to talk about anything before we get to recommendations, however you want to do it.
I think if you go through the recommendations, then we can ask some questions and go for the conversation after that.
Okay.
I think we might overlap or address some of these during the conversation, and then that might be repetitive. So I think, if you don't mind, Commissioner Ella, I have them just go ahead and finish with recommendations, and then we can go back and ask questions after that. And,
Okay.
And then what other, do you want to also look at the key questions as well?
Yes, yeah,
Can we do both of
course.
those?
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
So again, these recommendations, these are staff recommendations. We did see some overlap in between our graduate student Clay, from the interviews, from our findings, from feedback from advisory boards. So these recommendations come from various sources combined together. At a minimum, we need to provide some things to the land use code. We need a definition, we need thresholds, or we should have thresholds, and clarify uses, zone districts, and processes. At a minimum, whatever approach is taken, we need those things. Staff recommends to establish thresholds by power demand. Some places have done it by area, like square footage. Power demand seems to drive so many other things related to a data center, so that is our recommendation. We also agree to tie impact regulation to power demand, so to tie that impact regulation to those thresholds, right? So that you're not reviewing an enterprise data center the same as you are a hyperscaler. Staff would like to focus on transparency and that impact hierarchy. So that's referring to the avoidance, minimization, and mitigation of impacts. And we find it very important to provide tools or language or however we go about it to have good monitoring and reporting on water usage, power usage, potential rate impacts, noise level monitoring, that sort of thing. It's hard to do that if you don't have good monitoring and reporting. We also find those use efficiency metrics to be good tools, whether that's for review as targets to hit or for the monitoring and compliance monitoring. Also find it very important, just as we would for a solar facility or a mine or something like that, to consider the whole life cycle of the facility, both in the operation and on the end of life of a facility. And we also want to make sure that we provide language in this code update to allow us to adjust the legislation when it eventually comes. So just to touch on those next steps again, we're going to request a 6-month extension at the July 13th land use hearing. Economic Workforce Development has a forthcoming business focus survey. The questions are written, drafted, and everything, so there's not much needed before it's actually published. Staff will then draft that land use code language review criteria, open that up to the public, visit all the advisory boards again, and eventually go to the hearings with Planning Commission and yourselves. So then we're back to the key questions, and we can start wherever you want.
Okay, I have several questions, but first, and then I'll have I'll let Commissioner Foss start, but I do have a lot of things I'd like to ask about. But first, I'm really glad we're going to extend the moratorium. I think we have a lot of work to do, and we want to do these well, and I'm hoping that we can be flexible and pivotal to try to influence any state legislation and try to get in there soon, because I think that's important as well, so we don't get preempted, but that's my opinion as an individual commissioner. Commissioner Foss, how about we ask maybe a few questions each and then give each other time to both ask questions, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your comprehensive presentation, both of you working on this, Cassidy and Scott. All of the materials, all the research. Thank you to the graduate student who is from DU. If you could convey our appreciation to Clay. I do have a few questions, but I'll follow the format that has been suggested. The first couple of ones are easy. One is, did you say, Scott, that by July 13th land use hearing, we would have draft land use codes?
No, July 13th is when we would request the extension.
Yes, I understand that, but no draft regulations. Thank you. Related to that, you mentioned the survey that the economic and workforce folks are putting out. What is the time frame from that? When is that going out, for how long, and how will that specifically inform our thinking about the overall process?
Yeah.
Mark,
Oh.
would you come up and introduce yourself, please, and speak? Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Good morning, Mark Johnston. I lead our Larimer County's Economic and Workforce Development Department. So, Commissioner, we have a survey. It's ready to deploy by the end of this week, early next week. We've been in partnership with Rebecca and her team on that. We intend to run this for 3 to 4 weeks, just to give the most comprehensive set of information we can, of course, to Rebecca's team, and then, of course, you as well. We intend to deploy this across our municipal partners who support economic and workforce development work, our workforce board, and then different channels of our newsletters where we have our business audience.
May I do a couple of follow-ups to that?
Yes.
Thanks. Thank you. So I assume that the outreach will include the various chambers of commerce?
Yes, sir.
Yes, and is there a way at some point, or you could send us the link so we could see the questions that you're asking?
Yeah, would you like that before?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll be
As
happy
long
to
as
do
it's
that.
deliberative, or however we do that. And, yeah, I think that's all I have regarding this. So thank you for answering my questions. May I do one or two more questions, or
Yes,
one?
and I'd like to ask them. Thank you.
Yes, I know. Thank you, Mark. Let's see. Oh, yes. Regarding the matter of the potential impacts on people who use electricity and how much they pay, ratepayers, I understand, thank you, that we are not a provider. But can the regulations, or the proposed guidelines, regulations, include some reference that either as an incentive or it's required that if this contributes to the cost of electricity for regular folks, that even though we're not the provider, we can ask Poudre Valley REA, Platte River Power Authority, or Excel to make sure that that burden is not falling on regular folks. Can you speak to that, sir?
Yeah. I think one, again, if anybody has any input they want to provide, that'd be great. But one way that I would consider something like rates and something like water, power demand, that sort of thing, to kind of, you could address them in a similar way in providing an impact study, so what is potential impact to rates from that kind of study. That's one way that it could be addressed. There could be others, and I don't know them right now.
Okay, thank you. So obviously that's something that we're considering regarding what role the county has to make sure that there's not a disproportionate impact on regular people, because cost of living is the way it is.
Yeah, I'll add that there could be requirements built into the code related to how coordination occurs with the energy provider and what type of agreement must be in place, whether it's a large load tariff or some kind of documented coordination or agreement, similar to what we sometimes require from coordination with Colorado Parks and Wildlife or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's another mechanism. We can have performance standards. We can also have coordination requirements or some kind of requirement for an agreement of some sort.
I would also mention that similarly to other places in the code, we could have some allowance for a third-party evaluator. So if staff does not have the expertise to review something like a ratepayer impact study,
Great.
that one could be arranged for and paid for by the applicant in order, a third party as well, right, to be able to evaluate that effectively.
Great. Thank you kindly. I'll reserve my follow-up question and other questions to a later time as time allows. Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Sure. First off, thank you. I know there's a lot of information and a lot of folks and a lot of opinions, but we know strongly, obviously overwhelmingly strongly, where Larimer County stands on this. I want to say, job well done, I know, but it's also probably by next week there'll be something new to look at. It's moving so quickly. I have a few, but I'll be respectful and then we can go back and forth. But first, I'm going to go first back to what you said about the stakeholders and the third party. Just like we have with short-term rentals or other land use codes, we get like referrals or referral parties like from the fire district or others. So we could maybe have something like that, as you said, third party saying, do you think this is something that you will have the capacity for? Because I do know in Texas and stuff, they're pretty much almost telling everybody prepare for rolling blackouts, brownouts, all those things. So I'm just wondering will that be something we can do to at least get an idea of the impacts when you talk about tying it to the regulation power demand thresholds? Is that one way we can get another layer of can the need be met? Am my question clear, or is that kind of complicated?
I didn't follow it.
Well, so if we have referral agencies from power utilities from other areas asking about the demand and whether they feel that is in the future demand that can be met, is that something we could ask as a referral agency just to give some feedback on that?
And I think I can provide a response to that. Cassidy Few, our principal planner with community development. Yes, so staff are not proposing that this use would be permitted as of right with no planning process. So as part of that, any application would be referred out to our referral partners, similar to typical applications now, at which point they would be able to provide, either upfront some comments or potentially down the line through the process, more detailed comments. I think the third party that Scott was referring to was if any of the technical documents that are submitted as part of that application are not within the expertise of staff, we would have the ability to hire on a consultant who could review that in lieu of staff and provide a technical response, whether that would be sufficient or additional details were required. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes sense. That's helpful, thank you. And I'm glad you brought up the use by right, because that was the one thing I was told, never, 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 never allow that. So from all the people that have been doing this for 15, 16 years, that's lessons learned. So I'm glad to hear that. When we talk about, when you talk about really tying impact regulation, and I know there's criteria, but I'm wondering about when you say about the power demands, but also if the building's massively tall and huge and it's going to block view sheds, and does our OREA land use code kind of, because I've seen those, I've seen it where all of a sudden that's all they see is a big concrete wall. So I'm wondering what else is in the code? So if they put up a 70-foot tall warehouse-looking thing near a residential neighborhood, what do we have for kind of also that kind of feedback? Because I have talked to neighbors who are here, but other states where this was not considered, and it's been really life-changing.
Unless any use-specific standards were proposed as far as height goes, our typical height restrictions would apply. I think also we have heard in our interviews with other locations that the buildings sometimes don't look what you would expect them to. Perhaps they actually look more like an office building, like they can be smaller in scale than you might think. but it really relies on some pretty comprehensive standards. So we would look to include that in the land use code update if necessary. Otherwise, our typical height restrictions would apply.
Okay, that's helpful. And then, for now, until I come to the other one, and then I'll have a couple more questions, and I'll go through your key questions. I'm glad you talked about the process, about we would have a special review. And then also the 1041. So in my mind, that would be, if we, and I'm just asking, I'm not sure what, I've been trying to understand everyone's processes, but every county's different, right? How they have land use codes and do things. So if we had a special review and we have, and we have our process, but then any lines coming in and out would be a separate 1041? That's the first part of that question. And then if municipalities, which there might be some that say, oh, let's be the next data center alley, but we have all these transmission lines coming out. We would still have, that would be still part of that process. So we have like two things, two processes, one that if it's not in unincorporated and one that would be for transmission lines and other things. So I hope I'm clear about there's two pieces to that question.
Yes, there could be two pieces. So I guess I should have been more clear. This land use code would be for unincorporated Larimer County. So a municipality could adopt a different data center land use code regulation approach. However, if there are updates to infrastructure, which our 1041, as it's currently written, mostly deals with infrastructure, larger scale infrastructure. So yes, if a municipality built a data center, but it needed a new transmission line, and that transmission line triggered the threshold of a 1041, then a 1041 could be applied to that transmission line, but not necessarily the data center.
And so if I might build on, are we looking at, do we need to add anything to address for 1041 for that kind of scenario, just in case we needed a little more tools in the toolbox?
Well, we could look into that. It covers our 1041 activities of state interest. That's for those listening online, areas and activities of state interest. That's what the 1041 permit is. So their current list of activities covers things like power generation of different kinds, or conversion sometimes from one kind of power to another. Transmission lines of a certain size, 69,000 kilovolts is the threshold. Natural gas lines of a certain size, water and sewer pipelines of a certain size. Solar facilities as well of a certain size, which is a relatively low threshold, actually. So it covers a lot of different things. There could be some other things that could be adopted. For example, battery energy storage systems are not clearly stated in 1041. Could be an aspect of a data center. There are some things related to water that could be addressed as well. So there are some changes that could happen in 1041. Data center itself could not be adopted as a 1041
Yeah, no, I'm aware of
activity
that.
of state interest.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but you read my mind about the battery stuff, so thank you for that. So I will stop there, and Commissioner Gonzalez, your next question, sir.
Thank you. So just building off on that bit of conversation. So I've read how in states like Ohio, they have large-scale hyper data centers, and as part of that infrastructure, they're actually building power plants. So will we be addressing that? And if so, I would suggest that if they're going to generate their own power, that it needs to be renewable. Thoughts on that, sir?
So we've tried to be inclusive, of a data center facility, what is included in a facility, right? So that would be power transmission and potentially generation. And I think the permitting process would likely be a 1041 from the county side. Gas power plants seem to be a common on-site power generation, and I do not profess to be an expert on this, but sometimes if if it's like for one customer, then I don't want to misspeak, but a 1041 I think would likely address this. So for the gas, you can have the transmission of the natural gas and the generation facility generated from natural gas. And 8 inches, I think, 7 or 8 inches is the size of the natural gas pipeline for the transmission line, and also for a new power generation facility of a certain size. So there is a megawatt threshold there that would have to be met to use a 1041.
Just, thank you. Were you going to say anything, Cassidy?
I was just going to add, I don't think that we could necessarily restrict someone to applying solely if they wanted to have renewable energy as their proposed power source, if they were proposing additional power generation. But we could certainly have aspects in our code that sort of indicated that that was the preferred path. Because I think your question was, if they were proposing their own power generation on site, we wanted that to be renewable. Was that correct?
That is correct. That's part of my question. And whether we, like any of this, whether we require certain things in the code or incentivize certain things in the code, that was the overall direction
Yeah, and
of my
I think we
question.
could write the land use code regulations to perhaps encourage the use of renewable, or perhaps, that could be a criteria that they would need to meet. But I would look to Scott and Rebecca on that one.
Well, just
I think
because-
there's maybe a line here between 1041 more generally and data centers, and I'm hearing feedback from the commissioners to take a look at our 1041 regulations and make sure that we're fully capturing the potential infrastructure and impacts that might be kind of secondary from a data center, and making sure those thresholds are calibrated properly. And then also for data centers themselves, and looking at what their data sources or their energy sources might be. That is an area that we could look at whether, whether legally we can limit what those energy sources could be. And so that's a note that we'll take, and we can take a look at whether we could limit it to renewable sources only. I know that's what one of the proposed legislative bills from the last session dealt with, was renewable energy as the energy source. So we could look at what our authority is in that area, and if and how that could be built into any regulations.
Our graduate student also did some good research on this in terms of thresholds and mechanisms, approaches that the county could take, and that's where some of the efficiency metrics come in very useful. So the water use, which we could explore whether we would have the ability to address water use in terms of only cooling or indirect water use from power generation as well, which could be a stretch, but we could look into that. Also, the power use efficiency, to make sure that power use is efficient enough related to the amount of, I'm going to say it wrong. It's a very useful metric. The other one is renewable energy factor. So you're looking to have a certain proportion from renewable energy. And that is another one of those things that touches on many things at once. So if you have renewable energy, you also have less water use overall. So it can touch on several different factors at once. So those are some tools that could be used in the review process to address that.
Thank you. Just, if I may, two direct follow-up questions to this part of the conversation. And that is, regarding I appreciate earlier Rebecca mentioned that, one of the aspects of this, since we're not providers, could be greater coordination, MOUs, whatever, with, utility providers. I'm wondering regarding so thank you for that. I appreciate that very much. And maybe performance tying it into performance standards. I guess I'm wondering on the 1041 question, is there any discussion, Commissioner might know, about, at the state level, about adding data centers as a matter of statewide interest?
I'm unaware myself, but that's.
Well, I offer that just to be aware, and we should probably be keeping track of that. And I don't know if that's a better approach to some of this, but I just wanted to put it out there. And then finally, and then I can pause before I ask other questions or offer some direction here, and that is, so when we had Platte River Power Authority here a while back, and they were providing us an update. We did have a bit of a conversation on data centers, and they mentioned that they already have in place large load tariffs. What does that look like for Platte River Power Authority? How would that intersect with what we're trying to do here? Is that a surcharge if over a certain amount of power is used, and then who gets the money, the utility, or does somehow that trickle back to regular folks?
Yeah, so Platte River Power Authority, PVREA, and different municipalities, they most of them, maybe all of them, have their own large load tariffs in place already, and it differs a little bit between each one, both in the threshold where that large load starts, and also some of the criteria. So, for example, City of Fort Collins is by power demand, and also about the timeline and amount of construction in order to provide the infrastructure to service that customer. So it's a combination of those things. But it varies a little bit between each entity. And I think generally it's meant for growth to pay for itself is the intention, and if they're a large load customer, then they're intended to pay.
So
for that.
the additional charges go to the utility in order to accommodate the expanded infrastructure needs for providing power?
Looks like Cassie wants to say something.
I was just going to add, I think with a lot of the large load tariffs, it's typically individually negotiated with the customer. So depending on the size of the customer, if they are designated as like a large customer, a large service, the power provider negotiates that rate with them. And it's typically, I think, it's moving away from the standard rates that they provide to their either commercial or residential services. And it's more so based on actual power demand. Above a certain threshold is how they get designated as a large load customer. But it's not once they've hit I don't believe it's once they've hit a certain amount of power used that it comes into play. I think it's negotiated for their rate most of the time.
Or can a large load tariff be used potentially in the future to offset potential increases to ratepayers?
I think we would need to look to the power providers to respond to that, but
That might be part of it, any kind of coordination perhaps. Thank you, I'll pause.
If I could offer just one more comment on the questions related to 1041 regulations. My understanding of 1041 regulations is really that they are intended for land uses that are important to the state and yet are difficult to cite locally because they have major impacts. So new power plants, new water reservoirs, new, major infrastructure, things like that. Data centers, we actually have more authority and ability to regulate data centers without them being designated as a 1041 activity of interest. We retain kind of our local authority to regulate under a special review or in whatever way because they are not a designated activity of state interest. So certainly there could be an interest at the state level, at the legislative level, to add those in as an activity of interest, but it may not actually benefit Larimer County's ability to regulate these facilities if they were added in as a 1041 use. So I just want to make that distinction there, that we have a lot of authority granted to us under 1041, but it actually, it defines the process and regulations a little more strictly than we have the ability to do for something that is not designated in that way.
Thank you. Gosh, good insight.
I think that's a good point, and mostly I'm just interested in what we have as tools for those that happen in municipalities to make sure what impacts for the rest of folks. And also there is concern, that's one of the resolutions I've been working on, or not working on, but joining in on, was the transmission lines and maybe preempting any local control. So I just brought that up for some things that keep me up at night. So I'm going to go through the questions because we're out of time real quick. First, I want to say I would love to get the questions from the business, deliberative early. I would love, before all these other committees get to have any input on the criteria and land use needs, I would like to look and go through them as first, because sometimes I feel like I get things after they're all watered down and refined, and I would like to be maybe running alongside and reading and having some input all along and not at the very end. That's kind of important to me as an individual commissioner, so that's what I would like to request. What level of regulation or limitations does I support? Maybe a little bit more in the bottom third of the chart, maybe a little bit more restrictive than the middle, but that might change. I'm still wondering how this all is changing, and I think there's some things I don't know how we build in to be able to have flexibility or ability to pivot when the industries are changing, and so that we don't have to come back and how do we build that in? So I'm not sure what that looks like. So I would be a little bit more, I'm not sure we need to go all the way to banning as some other counties do. I want to be open to the possibilities that this might bring some things, and I know there's some different scales that that might be co-located, or these edge, or some of these cloud ones, and I don't know what kind of infrastructure that we need to look at for the cloud ones, and because now I'm hearing that most of them are just maybe going to put them all up in space, and so to get away from the land use code. So I'm just curious about that.
Madam Chair, if I may interrupt, we do have time scheduled until 11:30. So
Oh, we have some more time.
If I
Okay.
don't want you to have to rush,
cool.
knowing that we do have additional
Okay,
time.
so, well, let me go through these really since I started, then we'll go back, because then I have a couple more questions. Do the proposed data center definitions and thresholds align? I'm not so, I guess I'm going to circle back to that, because that's where some of my questions are. And are there locations and zones in the county that may be appropriate for data centers, subject to development standards and review processes? Maybe the heavy industrial near major highways and already loud and vibration things that are near some of this core infrastructure anyway. So maybe. I'm seeing some put in open spaces in other states near water sources, and I really would probably not be a happy camper or thrilled about those kinds of things out in, open spaces. And, I mean, they're away from people, but it's still disturbing wildlife and near water sources, so I have that issue. And so I'm open to exploring the potential benefits, but also I just think that right now, with this overwhelming feedback from the public and some of the things I'm learning, I'm just not sure that, I'd have to be really convinced about all the benefits of it. So, and then the expectations for public further outreach. I think you guys have done a lot of outreach, and I think right now it's probably time for just digging in and kind of looking and crafting these things. So that's the question. So back to the definition thresholds. Help me understand when you talk about just tying it into looking for the metrics on power load. Would the criteria of water and noise and vibration be built into that? Or, because I'm also wondering if it's a low power load, but it's got a large vibration thing. I'm just guessing, but I mean, I don't want the other impacts of water and other land use things not to be as important or as the power drain. I know that's really critical because we know that's been impacting people, so I'm curious about what that looks like.
Yeah, I think something like noise could be applied across the thresholds. So if you have a mid-scale threshold versus a very large facility, noise can still be an issue, especially if you're near residential areas or along or sensitive natural areas, something like that. So it's something that could be applied across those threshold categories.
Okay. And since we have more time, thanks for reminding me, Rebecca. I was like, oh, it's 11 o'clock. I'm curious about existing, you talked a lot about, we have some of these that maybe people didn't know that's what it was, they had a different name. But if they're upgrading or changing operations or infrastructure, would they also then have to apply through this process? Or would that be a different pathway through our land use code if they were already approved use? But if they're going to expand or change technology, how would that apply for already existing ones in the county?
I think expansion makes sense to be, that would need to be addressed, but switching out equipment on the interior, I don't know if that would qualify as a,
I'm wondering about noise and
Permit process.
vibration and water use and things like that.
I think it would likely fall under our Article 110 standards for non-conforming uses and expansion of those uses and that sort of thing. So yes, there would likely be a threshold that would be triggered. And just to clarify, I do believe most of the existing ones that we considered in the county are actually in incorporated areas. Just we consider them within the boundaries of Larimer County more broadly to get some feedback from those incorporated municipalities. So there's not a lot of them out there, but a lot of them are sort of ancillary uses, like Scott mentioned. So it would really be dependent on the scale of that expansion and what permitting processes that would trigger.
Okay, that's helpful. Commissioner Falls, I have some more, but do you have some more since we have more time than I thought?
Yes. So my next question, and I hope I can get these answered as best as we can before I answer your questions. The next one relates to zoning districts, and you have suggested that one option is heavy industrial or heavy and light industrial. My understanding is that there are two zoning districts that are heavy industrial. One is Rawhide, that whole area, or parts of that area. The second is, I presume, where the new landfill is going. So if we just kept it to heavy industrial, that would certainly limit where these things could go. Regarding light industrial, can you give us an overview of how many of those zoning districts there are? I think ESAB or somebody provided a map or something, but what are we talking about there?
There are still very limited light industrial sites in the county. We do have some mapping that was created a few years ago now when Michael Whitley brought forward a code update around the mushroom businesses as part of the marijuana code. And so there are maps available that show those zone districts. They're largely located in proximity to incorporated areas, but they are still limited in terms of number of properties in the county.
How are they in terms of incorporated? Well, urban or municipalities, that would be growth management areas?
Correct.
And one of the comments that I think Commissioner Shattuck McNally made was about, in terms of location, near the I-25 corridor, how many are there light industrial that are along the corridor, I-25?
I would have to look up the exact number. I believe many of them are actually located along the Mulberry corridor and to the west of Fort Collins. I do have a map available, but it will take me a minute to pull that up.
That's okay.
And if I could add one comment about zoning, as you all are very familiar with, a property owner can request a rezoning. So while there are only a couple areas of the county that are zoned as heavy industrial now, that could be another kind of check built into the process, is that a property may have to request a rezoning first and then might have to go through a special review process from there, depending on what zone district is applied, if that's the direction that we go.
Great, thank you. Just a couple more for now. See how far we get here. So staying with the zoning district theme, and given that from the public input that we received, various channels of public input, 94% indicated they don't want data centers in Larimer County. Scott, Cassidy, help us to better understand if we were to go down in that direction, because I'm either in that direction or the highest. I want to hear about the potential economic impacts. I'm not quite sure about jobs created and all that. But I'm inclined to go in that direction, or certainly, as I think Commissioner Shattuck McNally said, really, really strong review criteria that there's a lot you got to do to get something located here or approved. But I'm wondering, you had mentioned something, there could be impacts if we were an island of no data centers surrounded by islands of data centers. What exactly does that mean? What does that mean? Or is that good or bad, or?
Not saying, well, so one impact would be air quality, right? So if you have backup generators that have to be run and maintenance and operated so often, or they have to be run for backup power generation, then there could be some air quality impacts. And some of those air quality impacts are permitted through the state, through CDPHE, which does not eliminate all emissions and emissions issues, right? It just means that they're monitored somehow, they're meeting some kind of standard, but it does not mean that that air does not blow into Larimer County.
Well, goodness gracious, Scott, on that note, we already have air quality issues that largely emanate from Weld County based on one of their primary industrial activities, and I don't think we have much say in that matter.
No.
You mentioned water. Buy and dry.
Well, so yeah, buy and dry, of course, if water delivery systems and the ditch companies, water companies, they can service multiple counties at once. So if you have buy and dry, that can be an issue indirectly across county lines as well.
Commissioner, if I could go back to your original question too, I wanted to provide a little bit more insight on what Scott mentioned around sort of the potential of being an island surrounded by. That was actually a sentiment that we heard through Planning Commission, where they mentioned, maybe there was something to be said for having strict regulations and requirements that would allow them to locate in Larimer County, where we could have those strong regulations and have a little bit more oversight, versus them being located directly adjacent to us, but us having less oversight on those impacts, if that makes sense.
Gosh, that's very helpful. Thanks for clarifying that, Cassidy. I'll do one more.
Sure.
Oh, thanks. Well, I don't want to combine three questions into one. That's cheating, I suppose. Oh, my. Well, I'll go with this one, and then I'll make sure we have time for that. I think in your presentation, you talked about incentives being clawed back. Does that mean that one of the lessons learned in terms of the research and around the country, or that whatever mega incentives, economic incentives were being put out there, there's a little bit of buyer's remorse on that, or
That seems to be the case in some locations.
is that right?
Yes.
It would be helpful, and maybe that's in your 78-page report, to know more about that. Is that covered in your, or will we get some more insights from our economic and workforce development folks? Oh, dear.
This is Janine Lettingham, Associate Director of Economic Development. So what we've seen, or what I've read, is they're all tied to specific bars that these centers need to meet. That's the clawbacks if they don't, in terms of employment, in terms of revenue generation. So there are definitely examples out there of that happening.
Certainly have commissioners I'd be more than happy to connect you with that have done this for 16 years that are now calling everything back in the big national database that I shared with staff from the Harvard Kennedy School that has some concerns about incentives and the values of those.
I appreciate that offer, Commissioner. I'll respectfully decline, and hopefully the folks can provide a bit of a summary of, what lessons learned in terms of incentives that were offered and why what's being pulled back and why. One last question. And that is regarding the definition that you all put up there. Did folks from the Environmental and Science Advisory Board and some of the other boards and commissions, but in particular ESAB, because I thought they gave this a lot of attention, and thanks to you all for coming to present a few times, did they agree that that definition met our needs as far as being comprehensive and not overlooking something?
For the most part, there is some tweaking. There's a switching from an and to an or, that kind of situation to make sure that I can go back to it here. So near the very end, a data center may include associated ancillary structures, including but not limited to offices, security buildings, cooling water structures, and/or backup powers. They just want to make sure everything was encompassed, and certain aspect could be parsed off and not included in the review of the data center. That was one thing related to the definition itself. There are a lot of organizations proposing definitions for data centers, so it's worth making sure that they're along the same lines and we're generally talking about the same thing.
If I may, it refers to backup power systems, but isn't it correct that we're seeing that some data centers, if they're really large, are creating their own primary power systems? Therefore, are we addressing that if that were to be an issue here?
We should address the primary as well as the backup. Is that what you're suggesting?
That's the question. Isn't there a need to do that perhaps if, like we're seeing in some parts of the country where they're building power plants, either natural gas or some other perhaps fossil fuel? Just, you guys are the subject matter experts.
Yeah, I think we should address primary and backup power
So
systems.
that might be an adjustment perhaps to
Okay.
the definition. Thank you. Should I answer the questions about direction, or you want me to just be quiet for a while?
Let me ask my questions, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, I'm hoping that you'll lead, I'm glad that you contacted my contacts about their learned lessons, about how they have pulled back incentives and their community almost is completely flipped on what they think is a community benefit. So there's a lot to learn from those commissioners, and those communities have been through this. And the Harvard link I thought was really impactful, and hearing from a national expert on that and economic workforce development was really interesting. So there's valuable information, so appreciate you letting me share that. And also, my question, that one thing I don't see a lot of, and I know you're going to come to the Natural Resources Advisory Board, but I don't see much about wildlife corridors and impacts to wildlife. And I'm really worried about habitat destruction and also fragmentation. We had Dr. Knight and was with me up in Estes Park, or not Estes Valley, over the weekend, and we were talking about the even hiking trails are detrimental for especially diurnal mammals, and fragmenting habitat, and especially for chipmunk that's really hard because that's only during the day and they're trying to find places to go, and when they get fragmented in the heat, it's pretty impactful for I know it sounds like, well, who cares about chipmunks, but it's part of the big cycle, and that's really impactful. So I'm wondering, I didn't see much of that emphasized about for fragmentation and transmission lines and wildlife and the noise. I know I keep going back to the vibration, but I think this is a unique circumstance where the vibration is important. So I'm wondering about how we're getting impacts on wildlife and habitat, especially, so with
Yep.
these. So-
Yes, so I didn't put every suggestion and recommendation from all the boards that so far. Environmental Science Advisory Board did provide some recommendations regarding wildlife and siting and fragmentation, so that's just not one that made it onto this presentation. We also have Article 4, which covers various code sections like wetlands and wildlife specifically. So there is a wildlife code, and if it went through special review, then Article 4 would apply, and then if we had something additional, then we could look at that as well. The heat is an interesting one. I know the director has had an interest in the heat impacts as well. It is not something that is well known or studied. There is some nascent studies out there, but it needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. But it is an issue. And then we also have referral agencies. So CPW is always a referral agency, National Wildlife Service. And then we require looking at Codex, which is a online database with a lot of habitats. So all these things get utilized on a normal development and would certainly be utilized on a data center as well.
And just to jump in on that as
Yeah.
well, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, at the very beginning of our public page being live, reached out to us indicating that they really wanted to be actively involved, so we've been coordinating with them as well.
And their interest was really on once we had draft language, they wanted to take a look at it. So we're about to that point.
Yeah, I would love to see that emphasized. I'm really concerned about the heat. I still think there's some, even if it's not completely fleshed out, I think we could have at least a framework or something in there about the heat, because I do think the additive and cumulative heat impacts, especially with that on top of fragmentation, on top of all these other things, vibration, I mean, that there's the cumulative impacts I'm concerned about. So we can talk about this more later, but I do want to say I'm going to probably, that's some of my comments on one of those pages. I'm trying to break them up into subject areas for my questions. So did you want to add something more?
Yeah, real briefly. So there is some precedent around thermal monitoring that has happened in the past at power plants. It usually has to do with water quality, thermal plumes into rivers and lakes, that sort of thing. The FAA also looks at thermal plumes in the air, but only within a certain distance of an airport. So there's some precedent in a way. It's a different medium, water versus air, but something we could find a way to address it somehow.
I'd be curious and be interested in doing that. I've been looking into that myself. I'm assuming that dark sky, was already in the code, but those are addressed in here and would be part of that, so we wouldn't.
Part of Article 4, yep.
Okay.
Exterior lighting
I
code.
figured that. And then, we're talking about siting and setbacks. And I haven't got to read through this whole thing yet, so. What has arisen as maybe an exemplar for setbacks or near homes or especially marginally impacted communities or communities that maybe might live like a mobile home park closer to an industrial site and their home structures might have a different reaction to vibrations or noise versus a traditionally stick-built house. And so I'm wondering how, if they're near different kinds of manufactured homes versus other neighborhoods, would that have different impacts, especially near industrial zones? And would we have, since we have those mobile home zones, would we have some considerations to look at different impacts when those homes might have absorb or feel those impacts differently? And I've been thinking about that.
That's a great point, Commissioner, and I suppose we could address it in different ways. Oil and gas has some reversed setbacks. That's how they address that, and that could be one way. And another way would be looking at the noise impact. So you have to hit a certain level of noise at X, and you could do that as a reverse calculation, right? So if you have this level of noise at this point, then you need to be back X number of feet in order to meet that. And that could be tailored to something like housing type. That is something we could look into, yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to circle back. Have there been exemplars of, I know Loudoun County has certainly been dealing with this for a long time, and a lot of lessons learned there. I've also heard what's going near Brownsville and some of the other things in Texas and how fast that's evolving. So I'm curious, is there any exemplars of just standards architecturally or setbacks or, that kind of thing that's rising up for us to kind of maybe pay a little more focus on?
I haven't read it specifically from Loudoun County on that, so I couldn't name a specific exemplar, but there are some resources that we have one that our Clay, our graduate student, found that is a compilation of, not a compilation, it's a lot of example codes from across the U.S. for different issues. And noise is one of those issues where they list out some example codes from counties or municipalities. So there are examples. I might not have read that one specifically yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think for now, I'll wait and about a week or two, if it's all right, I will send my pages of interesting comments and questions, if that would be all right to you all, just for, as you're working in this. And then I already sent some of the resolutions that we're looking at to Rebecca and Leslie, if you're interested in looking at that. That might not be relevant or not, but just some concerns that we're all jumping on board with the National Association of Counties Environment, Energy, and Land Use Steering Committee. So they just really kind of evolved over the last 6 months. And so I think they're really important national policies we're looking at pushing for as well. So mostly preemption things. So that's local control kind of things. So it's very generalized. So I think you've got my direction on the key questions. So, and Commissioner Falls, did you feel like you got those key questions answered, or did you want to add to that?
I wish to add to that.
Please proceed.
First of all, a couple of quick points, and there's not time to answer a couple more questions, but, and I think I've partially answered your questions, but one key point is on the wildlife thing. I'm glad that's been brought up, so I'm grateful for that discussion. But also, I'm wondering, we need to make sure that we're considering any potential impacts on domestic animals. I hearken back to when we had our solar, when we approved the 10 megawatt solar array north of Berthoud, and we the issues that were raised by the adjacent horse equestrian facility. So I think we need to be mindful of potential impacts on horses and things like domestic animals. Secondly, I'd like to know more, well, regarding the whole life cycle of the facility. Thank you. I'm glad we're considering that. And the question there is two related to that. One is, are we also looking at that at the end of this facility's life cycle, there would be a need or requirement to address e-waste and, and recycled stuff like we need, with solar panels, for example. Apparently, we haven't figured that out yet. Maybe we're getting better. So I'm hoping that that's part of your consideration. And then I'd like to better understand another time, perhaps, what your reference to purchase agreements and how does that, work here. And then, so those are my points. And number one, yeah, I'm between 2 and 3, a little bit closer to 3 these days, in light of 94% of the folks don't want them. But I'm also mindful of, if, we're an island, your point that the Planning Commission folks is very valid, so that has to be taken into consideration. I think the definition and thresholds align with, our expectations. I think I suggested maybe some adjustment to the definition earlier. Zoning districts, yeah, I'd like to better understand. I think I've seen the map, but, if we do have these in the county, they ought to be closer to the highway, and they ought to be certainly an industrial away from residential and other things. And it's interesting that you mentioned, Cassidy, about a lot of the light industrial is along the East Mulberry corridor. So I think I've answered that question. And what expectations? Once we have draft land use code and we're ready to make that public, it would be great to get feedback from, that's what a lot of people want to see. And I'm hoping we can do listening sessions or other kinds of things between now and the end of the year to engage people, especially folks who live in mobile home parks that could be disproportionately impacted by these activities. I believe I've answered your question. Have I provided my version of clear direction?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your time
Yeah.
and your input.
So Lorenda, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I think you all have hit the high points. You have the direction. It feels like that you all need to go forward, and I think that was the point of today, to have these ideas bounced off of you and to get back. And I think if you set some time up with Commissioner Stevens, you can get the same kind of feedback as you go forward. Thank you.
Well, we're at time, and I want to just thank you all for, there are a lot of work that has been put into it. Please thank the graduate student and his work. That's impressive, and I appreciate trying to keep up with this ever-changing community. And to the point of we're an island, well, it's already happening. Right? I mean, they're going along Wyoming border and around, so it's already there. So it's not like we're going to, I don't know if we're going to change that or not. So, it's already happening. It's moving so fast. And those construction projects are happening now. So I just say it's happening now, and I feel like we're still, I know folks are traveling from here to go work those jobs. So I know it's providing jobs in Larimer County, but it might just be over the state line. But just want to say that. But I want to thank you for all this work and for coming today. I know this is just one point and a spot just for us to kind of take a breath and say, are we in the right direction? What do you think? But I would really like to have any, criteria kind of ahead of time and not see the final watered down, fine-tuned things. I'd like to see it all along and be able to put input in sooner. So, because these are really important to me, and I've been doing a lot of work for over a year and a half now, almost 2 years. And so I feel like it's just all the new stuff is changing every other week. It's amazing to me how a fast-moving industry can be that fast. So, but I want to thank you all, and thank you for everybody being here in the room, and thanks to Janine and Mark for being here and providing that feedback, and I appreciate the business survey. I think that's a great addition to that, so we make sure all voices feel heard. And there might be, you never know, it might be some we haven't considered. So I think we're in some new uncharted territory right now, and hopefully we can, I just want for us to do what's, best for Larimer County, and hopefully others will maybe take some of your wonderful already good ideas and things and build upon those. So at 11:32, we are adjourned, and I hope that you all enjoyed this as much as I did, and we wish you all a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.